Welcome from Columbia University's Nonprofit Management Program here at the School of Professional Studies. I want to welcome everybody who is joining us virtually this evening. This is not our first webinar to do this way, and in fact was planned this way initially, but it's very convenient. We are so grateful that we have so many folks who are going to be joining us, and we will also be filming this as well. We want to make sure that we acknowledge that we have students here tonight that are viewing. We've got faculty, alumni, guests of all sorts from around the Columbia community and across the country that are joining us. I am Cindy Lott. I'm the academic director here at the Nonprofit Management Program at the School of Professional Studies. I'm also faculty. And this particular topic in this series is very close to my heart. I've worked with policymakers for a long time. We know how important these issues are, but we wanted to make sure that we really address them in a very formalized way through our program. This evening is actually part of a 6-part election 2020 series. We've already had a couple events. This is our 3rd one, and we will have 3 more after this, which we'll discuss. We welcome all of you and your colleagues. This is whomever would like to join us by webcast. So there was a time when I had to spend a lot of time talking to students and sometimes even the charitable sector or nonprofit sector itself about why it is that policy and advocacy is so important. It is my hope that one silver lining out of the public health crisis that we are currently experiencing that ended our world, and also this primary season, which has been really, really interesting and had lots of issues raised. It's my hope that the intersection of these 2 events makes clear just how much the nonprofit sector and our communities have at stake. That it's important for our sector to engage, to influence, and to work with governmental officials in making them understand exactly our role vis-a-vis our communities across the country and also across the world. I'm extremely lucky to work with such amazing experts on these types of issues, and I'm very, very grateful that I've had both Sue Santa and Sandra Swirsky, who are the co-developers of this series, to help us and develop the entire 6-part series. They bring in experts on every single one of these events that we have that are specific to the issue that we're going to be dealing with, and that is true as well this evening. So I invite all of you to engage and to ask questions as you go through the evening, and I know that there will be a Q&A at some point. And with that, I want to welcome Sue and Sandra and turn it over to them so that they can welcome further our other guests and experts.
Thank you so much, Cindy. On behalf of my colleague and series co-developer, Sandra Swirsky, I want to express our gratitude to Columbia University for inviting us to create this series of workshops. And welcome to everybody who is joining us virtually this evening. We'll be keeping an eye out for your questions, so please post them during the workshop. We'll try to either incorporate those questions into our conversation or take them up at the end of tonight's conversation. So I'm very excited to be joined tonight by 3 dynamic leaders from our sector. Seiran Fu from Southern California Grantmakers, Andy Botner from Independent Women's Forum, and David Stone, who wears many hats, but is probably most familiar to us at Columbia as he is a lecturer in the Nonprofit Management Program. Now, when Sandra and I first conceptualized this series and what it would look like, we based our programming around the idea that the general election cycle is very predictable. The candidates declare themselves and debates begin. They start to campaign, there's more debates. Then the primaries follow in the late winter and into the spring. Convention hoopla starts to take over as we enter the summer, and that really dominates the stories for a couple of months. And then the final leg of the race begins with debates and ultimately the election. So in our first 2 series of workshops, in the first one, that is, we looked at the rules of the road. That would have been last fall. We looked at how nonprofits position themselves in elections, how they participate, and the structures that they might use to move the mission of their organizations. Then we went to a second workshop in December, and we looked at the intersection of the 2020 census and the general elections and what this might mean for nonprofits and the constituencies that many of them serve. Well, fast forward, and we could not possibly have predicted what would come. The unprecedented worldwide coronavirus pandemic has certainly jolted our general election season. We've entered an alternate universe where nothing is certain. So we're all rewriting our playbooks for the months that remain between now and November. This, we think, presents an even more unique opportunity for our workshops. So tonight and in the remaining 3 workshops, there will be one in June, one in November, and one in February 2021. We'll be bringing you leaders from the nonprofit sector who are navigating their issues in real time, who are adjusting to our altered reality, and who are demonstrating, we hope, the resilience and nimbleness of our sector. So tonight's discussion is going to focus on getting our issues in front of candidates. While a lot of our discussion to date has focused on the national elections, tonight we'll also be discussing elections at the local levels, local and state. Our speakers will discuss how they've crafted issue platforms for their organizations, how they get their messages to their target audiences, and how they ultimately reach the candidates. And of course, many of those well-thought plans, many, many months in the making, now might be obsolete. So we'll be asking our speakers, what now? To get tonight's conversation started, I'm going to turn the microphone over to my wonderful colleague, Sandra Swirsky. So Sandra, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here this evening under these truly extraordinary circumstances. I want to thank Andy Botner and Seiran Fu, both of whom I've worked side by side closely within the trenches, two extraordinary advocates for the sector. And we're so lucky and thankful that you're able to join us this evening. So I'm going to kick it off with Andy and Seiran. Andy works in DC for a women's organization and tirelessly advocates for their issues and all of our issues on Capitol Hill. Seiran joins us from California. Seiran is an expert in state and local issues, having worked in the State House and now works on behalf of grant makers in California. So to each of you, one of the roles you play at your organization is to advance your public policy agenda by elevating issues at the right time and in the right way to influence policy making in your areas. You each approach your work from very different perspectives, in very different forums, using very different methods. And while, as Sue noted, COVID pandemic has likely made you pause and begin to reevaluate and rethink your strategy moving forward, I'd like to take us back and rewind a bit to a time before COVID and have you take us through an issue or two that you've been positioning. And then later on, we're going to come back after we've had an opportunity to also speak with David and go through how you're repositioning, how the issues that have arisen since COVID has taken over our lives, and to help us think through how the issues we're dealing with might be affected. So Andy, did you want to kick off this evening?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Sandra and Sue. It's great to be with you. It really is an honor to be a part of the Nonprofits and Election Series discussion tonight. And I am always so pleased to have the opportunity to discuss the work of one of my favorite nonprofit organizations, the Independent Women's Forum, or IWF. Just for background, so everybody knows, the IWF, it's an educational 501c3 dedicated to developing and advancing policies that aren't just well-intended, but actually will enhance people's freedom, choices, and opportunities. We work every day to engage and inform women, and we're trying to create a community where people can discuss policy issues, including issues like paid leave, healthcare, minimum wage, education, taxes, and how those issues are going to impact them and their families in a real life way. As a 501c3, we're not a partisan or political organization, and we really try to focus on reaching those independent women thinkers. And with that being said, all of the messaging around our work is consistently geared toward attracting those women with common sense policy solutions and pragmatic approaches to address really any of the issues of the day. For those to know, IWF cranks out policy papers that are meant to inform the public, often with a policy paper on a headline issue. We do a communications piece that will support that policy paper. And then we have a very active website that posts this information and offers consistent and challenging and entertaining content to its viewers. We have a very robust media presence, which has really grown over the years on outlets that are both national and local. And we're constantly looking for ways to push various messages through multiple diverse spokespeople. So Sandra, as you had mentioned, with all of the issues, especially in an election season, I want to highlight for a moment one issue of great importance, certainly to IWF, and I think to most families in our country, something we've heard a lot about, which is the issue of paid leave. Do American workers have it? Do we have enough? To what extent should or does government provide it? And how active should government be in mandating that businesses provide it as well? And so when you think about that issue and how it will impact parents and caregivers and families, it's an issue that IWF zoned in on probably back in 2016, if not before. But in 2018, which was a congressional election year, the paid family leave issue really began to erupt in Washington, D.C. And so we promoted an idea regarding a way to provide leave to new parents that would be budget neutral and gender neutral. It would not raise taxes and it would be completely voluntary. In a nutshell, the idea was that qualifying workers would opt to receive benefit payments following the birth or adoption of a child. If they chose to receive the benefits, they would then defer retirement benefits in the future for a short period of time. The entire proposition is voluntary and between the government and the worker. So with that kernel of an idea in the time that we were in, we figured it was worth packaging up some specifics, create some materials that would summarize the approach, and then basically go fishing and go to see who might be interested in joining that issue and becoming a champion. I would say the ultimate policy goal for IWF at that point was obviously to make it the law of the land. However, they knew that if lawmakers embrace the idea, most likely there would be changes and concessions that would have to be made. So I would say it's pretty accurate that their secondary policy goal was to make sure certain principles surrounding the idea, like it being voluntary, fair-minded, not a burden to everybody, those principles would be incorporated into any new law. I think the timing was good at that point to introduce kind of a different approach into the political arena. There was a lot of attention at that time going to something called the Family Act, which proposed legislation that would impose a payroll tax on all workers to fund benefits for only those who would qualify. The Family Act would tax everyone equally, regardless of risk or the possibility of the person needing caregiving or parental leave benefits. There was a lot of momentum growing around this government approach to paid leave, and IWF took it on to try and counter that momentum and really broaden the debate at that point. We focused at the time on the US Congress making a choice to attract support and advocate for the idea in Washington, D.C. We knew we were looking for a champion, someone who wanted to own that, and then we would work with that person to enhance that proposal. So basically, I think a lot of nonprofits, you have your strategy map. And so we thought we needed to find out who would be interested in being our champion. And so we started pushing out editorial content about the idea. We used social media very aggressively to get that topic out there. We started floating the idea to those offices we are in contact with very consistently, friendly offices. And then we convened a press call where we had different members of the media, national, local, join a call with members of Congress who were interested in talking about the issue. And so after that initial introduction period, we learned that multiple members of Congress supported the idea and they were stepping up to lead. So now we had interest, and we had this proposal, we call it the Social Security Earned Leave Proposal. And at that point, we had 4 different US senators who were ready to go. Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa, Senator Mike Lee of Utah came up with legislation. We used our social media platforms to express support for it. We joined them in setting up a press conference to introduce the bill to the world. And then we again used our media contacts, our editorial pages to push out support for their now existing legislation. We continued to push with their colleagues and look for other members who would join their bill or something similar. And a little bit later, we had Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, Senator Mitt Romney of Utah crafted similar legislation. And we stepped forward to really push and support their efforts. And then, we know it doesn't stop there. That's in the Senate. So then we started looking in the House, who are those House members who might be inclined to approach this sort of effort, this novel idea. And we were very fortunate. Congresswoman Ann Wagner of Missouri and Congressman Dan Crenshaw of Texas, they liked it. And they basically very quickly introduced companion legislation. And then the cycle went around. We were able to support them and write about them, and then continually push that idea of Social Security earned leave. Meanwhile, in Washington, you've got the House and the Senate, but we had to always have an eye on what the administration was doing, knowing that this president, 2019, was starting to look very carefully at the campaign trail. And so for us, at that point, 2019, we knew that if we kept the discussion going on this topic, that this president was someone who wanted to make a mark and do something for working families. So we went a little broader than just the Hill. We started convening discussion forums with business representatives, association representatives, Capitol Hill staff, members, from the White House, staffs, coming together to have off-the-record conversations about this particular proposal, other Social Security ideas that were out there, other paid leave ideas and programs that could come to fruition. And I think it was good to have those conversations. People could be candid and speak freely about problems or hurdles they saw. And so we were able to convene quite a few of those. The debate went on. And then we also wanted to make sure we were paying attention to activities in the states. And at the time, a few of the states were talking about the issue. One in particular, Colorado, was moving very quickly. And so we figured that was an opportunity for us to start pushing our idea, our effort in Colorado media outlets. We started following what they were doing. And, as the debate evolved, as always seems to happen, we didn't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. So we noticed that, some people might not have loved our initial approach, but different ideas were coming up, and maybe they weren't as far reaching, or maybe they were in a bit of a different space, but we wanted to make sure that we were able to support those ideas that might have been a little smaller in scale or a little bit of a different approach, as long as core principles the organization believed in remained intact. And so, you know, we got it out there very publicly that we were part of the debate and not just wed to one proposal. You know, we had to come strong out of the gate, but then I feel as if that has now really positioned the organization to be in that discussion arena on the issue.
Can I break in for a question?
Yeah, please.
So thank you so much for taking us through all of the support that you built along the way. I know that during the presidential, and we're right in the midst of the presidential campaigns, paid leave is a huge issue for families and for the candidates from across the spectrum. And I'm wondering, you clearly had a forum in DC and with the current administration. Can you talk a little bit about other candidates' campaigns? Did you reach out to them? Why not? How much success you had, and did that buoy you on?
Yeah, I mean, as far as the campaigns went, you know, there are, on this particular issue, you know, I felt like battle lines were very clearly drawn. You know, there was something, the Family Act is very kind of lockstep, supported by the Democrats, certainly all the Democrat women in the Senate, you know, predominantly Democrats in the House. The overtures were made. I mean, for us as an organization, we wanted to make sure that though you might not think a candidate or a member would be willing to support an idea like this, we wanted to at least say that we approached and we tried to make those overtures. Because there was so much support on the Republican side of the aisle for this new sort of idea, I think because we are in this election season, immediately that probably scared off some folks who maybe on the Democrat side might have considered coming aboard. So I think there was definitely more of a partisan divide on this issue, not for lack of trying. You know, we look at it as when we have an op-ed as an independent organization and we put it out there, we're happy to speak with anybody. All takers are welcome. And that's kind of the approach on the Hill. You know, when I'm sending out information on this particular proposal, you know, I make sure that our friends on the Democrat side of the aisle and the Republican side of the aisle are getting a lot of that same information. But as far as getting presidential, it's, you know, we knew when President Trump came in, that was he and many in his administration were constantly talking about that issue and wanting to do something. So for us, we knew our chances would be better moving the needle, really pushing an incumbent president at that point to do something like what he did at the end of last year.
Well, it sounds like you hit your strategy right on the head. I'm going to turn it over to Seyron now, bring you into this conversation. Seyron, love to hear about what you're working on at the more state and local level and some of the issues that you're trying to drive attention to using the election as a platform.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sandra. And my gratitude to Columbia University's Nonprofit Management Master's Program, and to you, Sandra and Sue, for the invitation today. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to see if this works. We're going to be optimistic that technology will happen.
Looks great.
So, so it looks like this is working. So as Sandra mentioned, I'm here in Los Angeles, California. And one of the things that is really important to us here at Southern California Grantmakers, in addition to the issues related to the charitable sector, it's also the issue areas which our members fund. And so as an overview of this conversation, I'll talk a little bit about SCG, our public policy agenda, and then we'll flow into strategies that we're using to elevate that agenda to policymakers, particularly within the context of the 2020 elections. So a little bit about who we are at SCG. So as we mentioned, we're a grant makers association of about 300 foundations, corporate giving programs, and funders in an 8-county region. So those of you familiar with California specifically, we stretch from Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo to the Orange County, San Diego border, and from the Pacific Ocean to the Nevada border. So within this 8-county region, our vision really is for philanthropy to advance transformative change by collaborating with communities and across sectors to create an equitable and thriving society. And we do this by mobilizing people and organizations in philanthropy to achieve their missions and foster an inclusive community that learns and takes bold action. So that's the context by which we approach our work and engage in these efforts. So what does this look like from a public policy agenda perspective? So as I mentioned, our members are interested in the nonprofit sector and the policy issues there. And so we do advocacy work around, for example, in the last few days around increasing the universal charitable deduction within the Senate stimulus bill. And of course, making sure that our nonprofit partners are able to access the small business loans that were made available in the Senate stimulus. But we're also really interested and concerned about the issue areas which our members fund. And two of these issue areas are around child welfare and housing and homelessness. And they're a part of our adopted public policy agenda. And so within the child welfare context, we really see our role as using our convening ability to advance public policy that promotes the healthy development of children, and particularly children in our foster care systems here in Los Angeles County in particular. Here in California, the child welfare system is administered predominantly through the county system. And so acting at the local level, acting with the county is really crucial for us to advance systems change to do that. The second is around housing and homelessness. And I think it's no secret that, that California is experiencing a humanitarian crisis with 150,000 people experiencing homelessness as of the latest count. And this was, of course, pre-pandemic, and a part of, and the focus in our communities of how we end homelessness is crucial and drives and has a prominent place in our public policy agenda. And for us, this is looked at making sure that philanthropy's investments are aligned with public investments, increasing public investments in terms of permanent supportive housing for persons experiencing homelessness, and of course, tax policies that facilitate the construction of housing. So for these two issue areas, we thought, well, there's a really important opportunity here to engage our local officials, because as I mentioned, the child welfare system is run through our county system. And for housing and homelessness, the services which people experiencing homelessness use are predominantly provided by the county. So what was our strategy? How are we going to get there in terms of making sure what our desired impact was? So first of all, we wanted to protect and expand investments in the child welfare system. And of course, ending homelessness and building affordable housing. And how would we know we're achieving our desired impact? We would look at whether or not our policymakers are educated about these issues and making sure that they're salient and top of mind to them. And who's our audience? Well, of course, the policymakers themselves, but also community members, because public mobilization, particularly within the context of a policymaking body of elected officials, and who are responsive to their constituents, having educated members of our community who understand the issues was just as important as making sure candidates understood the issues that we cared profoundly about. And finally, the tactics we decided to approach was around decision makers engagement, and of course, communications and public policy systems change. And so from within this perspective and this approach to strategy, we really saw a candidates forum as a prime opportunity to further our goal. So why a candidates forum? So first of all, for many of you, as you know, local elections tend to be lower information elections for the electorate. And then within the context of California's primary having moved up to March, and in the throes of a presidential primary with, at the time in January, multiple candidates, the attention really was at the national level. and wasn't at the local level for this open seat. And as background, in Los Angeles, the Board of Supervisors is a 5-person seat, and they used to be known as the 5 Kings. And so now it's the 5 Kings and Queens, but each of their districts they're afforded immense power within each area. And Los Angeles County is about 10 million people. And so this seat was particularly important because the incumbent was terming out, and we would have new candidates in this seat, and there was a real educational opportunity. The second role for us here in terms of candidates forum was cementing our role as a trusted expert voice in community and with policymakers themselves, so that when they are elected, they turn to us for content and knowledge about child welfare issues, housing, and homelessness issues. And then finally, to build relationships, to start very early before they're even elected, to make sure that we're engaged with them and to understand that we can be partners together. And in fact, this race actually had 10 different candidates, and we chose to set some standards that would, a viability standard that would narrow the field so that we can have a conversation, thoughtful conversation in a nonpartisan way. And we were fortunate to do this with 2 partners, the Chronicle Social Change, which is a media outlet that focuses on children in the child welfare system, and United Way of Greater Los Angeles, which has made tremendous inroads in ending chronic homelessness with private and public partners. So what did this look like? What was the result of this? As I mentioned, part of our goal was around agenda setting. And so the candidates, in advance of participating in the session, had to fill out a questionnaire around the issues of child welfare and housing and homelessness. And so we were able to have on the record commitments from them and answers to the issues that we cared about. So we had these public documents posted, and through our partner, the Chronicle Social Change, they were published, and everyone was able to see what their perspectives were on the construction of affordable housing, their approaches to ending homelessness, and the reforms needed to make sure that children in our foster care system are thriving and safe in healthy homes. We're also able to educate them at the same time. I think there's recognizing that not everyone's gonna have a child welfare background, not everyone's gonna be an expert on affordable housing development. We really saw this as an opportunity to educate them about these issues as well as a part of the process. The second was community learning. We had over 200 attendees show up, and this was on a Friday night. So this is in a Friday evening in Los Angeles with plenty of other things going on. 200 folks from the community showed up to attend this session. So we felt like we hit our benchmark on making sure that in a low information election, the community members could attend and listen and learn about the candidates. And finally, we really did work towards establishing ourselves as a trusted voice. We had media outlets did cover the event, turned to us for information and content to all 3 partners related to child welfare, housing, and homelessness issues. And it was also really important for us to center people with lived experiences as a part of this conversation, because we understood that as 3 institutions, civic institutions and community, we have the immense privilege and access to media outlets and to elected officials, but not necessarily community members who aren't affiliated per se with a particular organization. And so centering people with lived experiences to make sure that they could get on stage and ask questions of the candidates, not from the floor, but be on stage with them on that podium, was incredibly important to us to make sure that these trusted voices were lifted and shared, and that the system change that we want to see was led by folks who had that lived experience. So there are a couple lessons we learned from this as I wrap up, which is, as I mentioned, there were 10 candidates, and we set forth as a nonpartisan organization a viability test that looked at that set a unique donor threshold, which was fairly low, 50 unique donors, and $25,000 raised. And so given the timing of the election and the forum, only 4 candidates, the 4 you see here, were able to meet those viability standards. And we were very grateful, and a shout out to the Alliance for Justice and Nonprofit Vote for being able to share that with us, because we wanted to dive deeply into this conversation and make sure that we were thorough and that we investigated these issues and the candidates' positions on them. And with 10 people, it would have been impossible, just given the logistics of that. And part of that experience was that we had several candidates who were very upset with us and who didn't know the rules and thought we were selecting people or preferring people, but because of the way the advice from the Alliance for Justice, we were able to establish a nonpartisan, objective measure to establish a field for viability that allowed us to dive deeply into this conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn that over back to you, Sandra, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can have a conversation with.
Great. So, Sayron, it sure doesn't sound like this was your first rodeo on putting together a strategic plan to try to get on the radar, not just of existing policymakers, but of candidates as well.
So this was actually our first candidates forum.
So it was your first rodeo.
It was an incredible, nerve-wracking experience, and we should be candid about that. I think after we went through this viability test, particularly around putting this forum, the anger that some of the candidates who weren't invited, I think we got really nervous about, well, are we doing the right thing? Do we really have a clear legal standing? Are we going to be in trouble with the IRS? And the advice that we received from our nonprofit partners, the Alliance for Justice, was crucial for us to be able to say, no, we're doing the right thing. Our purpose is to make sure we have a really thoughtful discussion. And in order to do that, we're able to put forth an objective viability test. And I think for us, it was making sure that given the fact they're in a primary election where candidates want to get in front of people, that this is a really good opportunity for us to say, hey, we are 3 trusted institutions in our community that can put on a larger event and that can broadcast it and share it with different people.
That sounds tremendous, and I suspect is translatable to other communities and to other issues to help those online and who will be listening to this. When you think about it, if you step back, what was your one kind of biggest moment? What was your one big takeaway that if someone said, should we do it? Could we do it? What's your one big piece of advice? Or as Oprah would say, your one aha moment.
For us, the aha moment was when the 4 candidates on stage spoke about how the questionnaires were able to help them learn more about the issues themselves. And the candidates themselves corrected each other, because one of the candidates was an expert in the child welfare system and was able in that moment to say, well, actually, wait a moment, we have expanded these benefits to the age of 21 for transition age youth. And that dialogue, that ability for the candidates to converse deeply about these 2 issues in a meaningful way, besides the sound bites that we may have seen in other national primaries with a lot of candidates on stage, I think was a really big aha moment that we did the right thing and that we were able to dive deeply on these issues that we care so deeply about.
Yeah. You know, sometimes, and I agree with you, sometimes if you invite people to a stage, it requires them to look smart, which requires them to do a lot of homework, particularly if they're going to be debating competition. So that's a terrific way of forcing candidates to learn about your issues by inviting them to compete against each other on a stage. So congratulations. So I think we now want to turn over to David, and I'm going to turn back to Sue to do some introductions and continue the show.
Thanks so much, Sandra. And thank you, Andy and Sayron, and look forward to you rejoining the conversation in a little bit. That was very, very interesting. I am delighted that we're joined tonight by David Stone. Now, David has served for more than a dozen years as Columbia's Executive Vice President for Communications and is now a Senior Advisor to the university's president. He is teaching a new elective course in the nonprofit management program called Creating the Language of Nonprofit Leadership. Before working in higher ed, he was a consultant on a wide range of mission-driven organizations, major foundations, government agencies, and public broadcasting, as well as a writer and producer. Now, particularly relevant to tonight's conversation, he's been involved in the communication side of moving campaign issues and proposals into legislative and executive action, and he has helped lead emergency and crisis communications for the governor's office in Pennsylvania and for more than a dozen years at Columbia. So we're going to shift gears a little bit here in the conversation with David, and I'm going to set up our issue, David. So there are many nonprofits that invest in policy and programs in areas that are fundamental to our civil society. Now, these might be citizenship, community service, civic engagement. And these issues are perennial, and they're not just year after year or election after election, but they weave through many decades. The nonprofits dedicated to these issues manage very long-term strategies, and they adjust those to reflect the times. It might be the current cultural norms, priorities, sensibilities, societal needs, however they might need to adjust in any given era. So David, at different times in your career, I know that you've spent a great deal of time on community service. So we'd be interested to hear more about that, including how the issue has shifted over time. And of course, I'd love to hear, and we'd all love to hear, what you have to say, what you could envision for nonprofit leaders in this area now to demonstrate the importance of community service as we know it and as it might become known in our particular time now during COVID-19, where community service could in fact look different than how we've seen it before. So I'm going to pass the microphone over to you and ask you to dive into that issue. And you just need to come off mute. Thank you.
Okay, mine says the opposite. So first of all, Sue, thanks a lot. And Sandra, and thanks to my new boss at Columbia, Cindy Lott, for inviting me to do this. Look, this wasn't exactly the event, the election, or the historical moment that anyone expected even a month ago. And to Sue's point, I was going to talk about how one mission-driven sector that I happen to know well, not as an advocate within the field, but as a political campaign and executive branch at the state level and legislative branch at the Senate in DC, how I experienced and have experienced this kind of advocacy and what seemed to be effective. And also to give people a realistic sense of what it's like to be in a campaign and have people like you coming to work with us. And I was asked, because of the moment that we're in, really to talk a little bit about the whole challenge of emergency communications for nonprofits. Those of us who worked in this field, whether in government or outside of it, have a certain playbook. Many institutions are not big enough to sort of support the full-on kind of emergency response. But the reality is, I think we've all discovered in the past few weeks that every single organization needs to be prepared to deal with a crisis that they really might not have been expecting. So I'll get to that in a really changed set of remarks. So one reality of campaigns, you know, I was lucky enough to be the first communications director of a campaign that James Carville ever won many years ago. And one reality that I think I can convey is that you may encounter candidates who care passionately about your issue because it's maybe what motivated them to get into public service, but campaign professionals are really only interested in how you can help them win. And how do you get to 51? And how does your nonprofit organization and mission possibly fit into that? Does it bring votes? Maybe not. Does it bring dollars? Probably not. Is it the source of maybe a good story for the candidate to be able to tell? I think back in the old days when so much campaigning was done on television spots and you had to convey everything in a handful of 30-second spots that were so expensive to put on TV, it was actually harder. I think in this age of social media where there's an extraordinary amount of micro-targeting, it's possible for issues that in the past would have been considered niche and not important enough to be part of a main campaign message. Well, you know, nowadays there is a level of outreach to people who care about these issues, who are your constituents, not just the candidate's potential constituents. So I think that's one way things have gotten somewhat better. So I want to sort of just briefly allude to some history that I'm not going to speak as long about as I was going to because of the context that we find ourselves in. So my old boss, Harris Wofford, who died last year, was you know, an aide to Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy, and he helped Sarge Shriver found the Peace Corps. He was a college president who then went on to be a multi-decade advocate of national service and civic engagement. So he ultimately went on to work with Ted Kennedy in the Senate when I was working there to create the Corporation for National Service. And there's an important campaign story about how that came about. I mean, I will tell you, you know, he got elected for a more famous issue than that, which was healthcare reform. And if anybody's old enough to remember someone saying, if the Constitution says those accused of a crime have the right to a lawyer, then every American should have the right to see a doctor. Well, that sort of started with our campaign, and it's an example of one of the campaign issues that nonprofits can be involved with that are very cutting issues. We know that healthcare is an issue that moves votes. Other issues may not seem to be, but I think the question of how nonprofits can position what they're doing, you know, what does it have to do with healthcare? What does it have to do with jobs? What does it have to do with the environment and education? The things that we know people are willing, really do vote on. That's what's going to make campaigns the most interested in working with you. Well, that was a winning campaign message in 1991, but Harris, who'd worked on creating service corps in Pennsylvania, wanted to talk about it in the campaign, and his campaign manager, Carville, didn't think much of that, just as he didn't think very much of it when Bill Clinton wanted to talk about it in 1992. And I want to talk about 1992 for a second, and really give you some reading that will not be on the final, except from my class. It's a book that you could probably get in the library. There's only a few left on Amazon. It's called The Bill, and it's by Steve Waldman. The subtitle is How the Adventures of Clinton's National Service Bill Reveal What Was Corrupt, Comic, Cynical, and Noble About Washington. And what I like about this story is it so affirms some of what Andrea said and some of what Seyron said about how mission-driven organizations engage the political process, and in a very cynical process, ultimately are able to do some good. And, you know, Steve, who'd been a top national reporter and editor at Newsweek and US News, ultimately, he wrote this book, which is how I first came to know him. He then ended up working a few years later at the Corporation for National Service with Harris, and has been a serial social entrepreneur himself since then, who recently created sort of a Teach for America-like organization for journalism called Report for America. So he's now a nonprofit leader as well. And I'll say just a couple things that came out of this book, but really just suggest if people can either get it out of the library or find a used one on Amazon, it actually tells a great story, and we're going to be talking about it in our class over the next week. So I think the key things are this. Bill Clinton, it turned out, was passionate about this issue, and that's the first most important thing that you need to have as a candidate who actually cares about what you're doing. And it really makes a difference. He'd worked on the issue as a governor, and, you know, from a strategic sense, I think he's not the only one. Barack Obama felt this, Pete Buttigieg felt this, and Republicans have felt this. They wanted to capture some sense of that JFK Peace Corps sense of elevating America, whether or not it really moved votes. He had a policy team that was willing to find a way into the issue with him that would connect with a broader sense of voters. In that case, they connected it with what was already the big problem of college costs and college debt. And so it became a program that was a trade-off for help with going to college and pay as you go, you know, pay back for tuition. So it really connected in a way, even for people who might not be involved in service. And then I think the other thing, and it's been alluded to a little bit by Andrea and Seyron, anyone who's involved in, who's watching or who knows anything about the service world, it's actually a very eclectic group of nonprofits with different focuses and different philosophies about service, about who's being helped and what the goal is, and service learning versus volunteer service. But it was also important that the sector ultimately came together on certain broad goals that they could advocate and shared message points and advocacy that could be bipartisan. And I think a lot of what Andrea said about the bipartisan nature of their outreach is very, very important, especially at a time where the polarization is so deep. And finally, to Sue's point, you now have an infrastructure of service organizations that are very savvy about these kinds of political battles in Washington and their state governments, and they're very good at outreach on a bipartisan way. And they've engaged campaigns over and over again. And here's one that and by the way, the broad messages can be very broad. For the Corporation for National Service, it was as simple as getting things done, or for the sector, it could just be making a difference. And so, being able to find common ground where many nonprofits could come together was obviously a very big point of that. So quickly, my own experience of this is because I met a lot of these people from my previous life in 2008, when the organizations sponsored the Service Nation Presidential Forum with Barack Obama and John McCain, one of whom was a Columbia alum, the other was a Columbia parent just until a year before. We were able to bring that to Columbia's campus. It was not really our event, it was their event, in the same way that Seyron describes the kind of candidate forums that he's put on. But it was going to be huge national attention. And for us, for me, in my old job, it was an opportunity to shine a light on where really a broad and deep array of service and community partnership programs that Columbia has in Harlem and Washington Heights. And on the day of that event, the New York Times, we pitched a story to them that they put on the front page of the Metro section about our engineering in the community program. And so the entire service world that was here for that event got to see what Columbia was doing on it in that moment. So in my world of the media relations, that's kind of a home run. And I see Andrea nodding her head. We don't get those very often, do we, Andrea? No. So that's the kind of thing that I think it gives a sense of when you can put together a political coalition, when you can find an angle to the issue that moves not only your own voters, people who care about your issues, but people beyond it. And hopefully do find candidates who really care about it, or at least a campaign team that sees the benefit of working with your organization. I think that's what can make nonprofit organizations, even though they are nonpartisan, effective in this campaign context. So I guess the last point is this, Sue. I was asked to talk a little bit about crisis communications. And I think many of us have lived and worked through various public health and safety crises, but not really one like this. And it really, it's an issue that deserves its own session. We've been lucky enough at Columbia to work, if anyone's been watching TV, you've probably seen someone like Dr. Irwin Redlener on talking about disaster response and preparedness. Now, I had Irwin come and speak with our Ivy Plus group of communicators a few years ago, shortly after the Boston Marathon bombing that had a terrible effect on MIT, where someone was killed, and Harvard and the whole Boston and Cambridge community. Now, Irwin's a pediatrician and a public health expert, but he makes it very clear that effective communications is absolutely the sine qua non of addressing a crisis. And, as I said, I don't know how many of you who are already working in nonprofit organizations have already had to cope with the unexpected, but I'll make just a very couple of quick points about what I think needs to happen. First, preparation and infrastructure. Is there an emergency management team at your organization? Now, for those of us who've been in state or federal government, there's a big, Pennsylvania or New York or California emergency management agency that can convene resources and people around the governor. Big institutions like a university has an emergency management team that is organized by our public safety, that sets up a physical space that connects all the information. But I think even smaller nonprofits need to be able to know in advance who's your emergency management team, how are you going to connect with each other in real time? Does it include the people who need to do just the most mundane things like updating your websites, getting out emails, getting outgoing voicemail messages, the whole range of things you would need to do to communicate. You need not just the bosses, but you need the people involved who can actually help you do that. Do you ever practice going through that? Something that, you know, there are exercises that big organizations go through on this and governments go through on this. Last couple of points. We know that in a social media age, audiences expect very, very fast information from organizations, employees, stakeholders, the communities you serve, and you have to respond fast, but you also have to be right. And in a social media age, it's really put a premium on it. So often you need to prepare to communicate and even say that you don't know certain things yet, but at least get out there. And you know, I will tell you, I dealt with one emergency management situation in the pre-social media age. It was a prison riot and a hostage-taking situation. And in that case, it wasn't Twitter that was putting out rumors that were dangerous. It was local TV reporters who were making claims about National Guard coming in that led to threats against the hostages by those who'd taken them. And you know, you sort of had to deal with that. And I think that's what everyone now deals with on social media. So being able to get accurate information out fast is very, very important. Even though you have to choose them very carefully. We're seeing a lesson in that every day with the different approaches to emergency management by governors and mayors and presidents. And the tone of that matters a lot too. And as I suggested earlier, even if you're a small organization, are you ready to use all the channels you have? Your social media, your email, your website, a press release, interviews with the press to get out your message in dealing in a crisis. And then the final one is the broad one, which is even when information is not fully final, can you settle on and be able to convey a clear and consistent message that may have to change as facts change. So we're all watching that happen in real time by government officials right now. But I think people who are pretty at this at organizations have found, even if you're not directly responsible for people's health and safety, and many nonprofit organizations are, people really need to be ready to deal with this kind of crisis, and even one that's beyond a lot of our expectations. Sue, I really didn't get to your point about the role of the service sector, but it seems like that's a more nuanced one in the environment that we're in, where there has a lot of health and safety restraints. Sorry, that's my.
No, I was just going to say thank you for leading us into kind of the COVID discussion.
Right.
It's kind of the third part of the discussion this evening. So many of you, and particularly Sayron and Andy, who've been leading these public policy issues through the election cycle, really were in for quite an upending in the last couple of weeks. And your carefully crafted plans on how you were going to engage with candidates and lawmakers and incumbents was really thrown into disarray, right? And so you probably don't have all the answers. And David, we'd love for you to weigh in here as well. You probably don't have all the answers, but I do think it's helpful to our audience to hear your thought processes as you've watched this crisis unfold and had to, as leaders, react, pause, and then move your public policy agenda forward. What are some of the issues that you're prioritizing in terms of pivoting? What's some of the struggles you've had? And then as you see your way clear, what are some of the tactics that you're going to reposition to as the election cycle continues, but so does the crisis? So who wants to start off? Andy, ladies first. What about you?
Thank you. Oh, yay. Yes, Sandra, you're 100% right. Everything kind of got turned on its head. I think I will say this right now, IWF, we're in a good spot because, as many organizations are to an extent, there's so much telework and flexi work that goes on. For this organization, we've got a president who is in Germany. Most of our folks are around the country. I'm in DC. We've got a senior leader, a VP here in the area. But we've got a policy person in Colorado. Our chairwoman's in New York. So we're kind of used to a lot of teleconferencing, a lot of, we do a quarterly meeting where everybody gets together. But other than that, it's a lot of email and text and weekly or daily conference calls and check-ins. So for us, one very small silver lining was we were kind of used to not having an office to go into and gather around. So psychologically, mentally, I think that put us in good stead. We're also an organization, most of the women there, it's all women, and many have children and young babies. Myself, not babies, but we've got kids at home. And so we immediately knew if we were going to keep that communication going, everybody needed to take a breath and be even more flexible and recognize if we're going to have a 2-hour call, there might be a baby crying or a toddler running through, and you just do the best you can at that point, with our people. It was, that was that's more of a personal look into the organization. As far as the outward mission, I think because we're always looking to talk to women, and so many women are working women, stay at home and working, flexi working, juggling a million things. Those are the people that we're talking to. And it was very clear what a sad time this was and is continuing to be for a lot of families. And so immediately on social media, we just started becoming bombarded with messages of, my son's graduation is canceled, my daughter's prom, what do I do? My husband's elderly, I'm petrified, I'm crying every night. A lot of our subscribers were not looking. There was no paid leave debate going on at that point in the last couple of weeks. So we figured, how can we pivot and keep a conversation going with our supporters? And so I think we've done a good job so far of trying to get content up, about tips, being home with kids, handling everything, the latest COVID-19 updates. For me, I just try to be a conduit, everything from these different agencies in the White House. I'm getting out there, I'm pushing out there. We've got our China expert constantly writing, more deep dive policy, summaries, about what's coming out. So we're trying to provide helpful content, but we're also recognizing that our folks want to talk about something a little different. And we're making kind of not a give up list, a to do in the future list. This is not going to happen, maybe what we planned in May, but we're continuing to craft events or things that are going to go on. We're just looking at it like a fall pivot or a late summer pivot, just kind of rejiggering the timeline, but not giving up.
Thanks, Andy. Back to something David started with, and just to summarize, is that when you're in a crisis, the first thing you do is secure your own organization. Because if you don't secure your own organization and rethink how you're going to communicate and get your job done, then really everything else is superfluous. And it sounds like that's where you all started, is let's take a moment to make sure that we're all pulling in the same direction and all of our needs are being taken care of as employees. And then we can really get back to business, which is selling our agenda. Does everyone have any comments?
Yes, to definitely ditto to all the points that Andy made. I think one of the things that from just a lessons learned from our experience is a year and a half ago, Southern California Grantmakers with our two partner organizations, Northern California Grantmakers and San Diego Grantmakers. Together we formed Philanthropy California, an alliance of all three regionals in the state. But we undertook a disaster resilience plan. And we actually have Alan Kwok, who's based at Northern California Grantmakers, as the Director of Disaster Resilience. And as many of you know, California is very prone to natural disasters, earthquakes, wildfires, you name it, we have it, from the land and from the air, but of course, a pandemic was never what we thought what we would be activating for. But when the time came when community transmission started happening, there was an infrastructure in place that allowed us to start working with elected officials who are looking for resources and one liaison to government, right? So Alan has been in communication with the governor's office on a daily basis and really having a incident command structure that is flexible, but also respects in some case some measure of hierarchy that is really needed so that we're not getting 500 emails about the same information. That there's a real thoughtful and understood mechanism to share information internally and also externally with our staff. And I think that has allowed us to be responsive in this moment that we didn't plan to do. And the second piece there, I would say, is government relations, as all of us know, is so relational. And now we're in a situation here in California where our state capital, like many others, is closed. And so in the past, you could, if you can't get, if your meeting request is not being responded to, a scheduler may not be responding to you, you can sort of linger outside offices and just casually bump into the person you're trying to find and raise your issues there. So the question now is like, well, how do we go about doing this work when we don't have those moments, those opportunities? And that's where I say the relationships that you've invested in making through your connections to the district office or to the state house or in DC are going to be really important, because those folks who might be able to help figure out, oh, well, why are they not responding? Who is responding and whatnot? So I think that's also been a lesson learned too, is that these investments that don't necessarily materialize right away do show up in these really extraordinary circumstances.
Sounds like California has already a great roadmap that you were able to jump onto for this latest crisis. David, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I mean, I'd be interested in whether anyone, and it's worth pursuing. Seiran, I think it's true that California, because it's had sort of endemic weather, fire, earthquake sort of plagues, it's remarkable that you have that shared infrastructure, you know, within your nonprofit community. And I mean, I'm sort of blown away by that. And do you have any sense of how wide, does anyone have any sense of how widespread that is? Because so many organizations really don't have this infrastructure themselves, but they are part of associations that could develop it. But it sounds like it's been especially in a moment, as you said, on the relationship side, where you can't lobby without a lobby. You can't buttonhole when you can't be within 6 feet of people. But the fact that you have a collective strength and organization is very powerful. So I'm just interested in whether that's something we see as a coming wave. Have others organized it? I think it's hugely important.
So Sandra, I'm going to turn our conversation a little different direction, but still around campaigns. So, you know, I've been reading, as we all have, commentary and thoughts on what election 2020 might look like. And so, you know, what's going to happen with conventions? There may not be any. Our primary season, which we're in right now, is starting to look very different. Will candidates even be able to be on the traditional campaign trail and have that interaction with voters? And then, you know, if we're, depending on where we are, as we get into the fall, how might we even cast our ballots? So it gets us thinking, you know, about how dominating COVID-19 could be for us, is for us. And so others, as I look at these articles, are starting to suggest that the candidates will really be judged and elected based on kind of how or what they're doing around this particular crisis. And I think that may be more pronounced at the presidential level, but it probably trickles through. And I think could also be very pronounced at the local level, where you're addressing things on the ground. So if you think about that, everything might be viewed through a COVID-19 lens, how might you pivot or shape or kind of reframe your particular issues to fit into that new kind of paradigm, that new filter through which these issues will be raised, and also stay in front of candidates. So I'm just going to throw that out to you guys and see what you think about that.
I mean, I can
Jump on
start from
Yeah.
sort of a public conversation perspective. I think for Andrea and Seyron, they're gonna, I mean, this is their job right now. But my sense is, well, first, none of us knows for sure what the next few months are gonna look like. That's just a reality. But one thing that is clearly developing is that campaigns are having online town meetings. Like, they may not be able to physically campaign, but organizing groups of interest around individual issues that can be done in a, not unlike what we're doing right now, is clearly something that I think will be occurring. And I also see an awful lot in the media that I know people here do feel, and it really goes to your earlier point, Sue, which is this is a moment where, on the one hand, there's going to be a political debate about the importance of government at a time when we've heard a lot of rhetoric for a lot of years about how, you know, we should have less government. That's one. But the other piece of this is the importance of our nonprofit and mission-driven organizations in addressing these wide range of needs, obviously including healthcare and all the other social services that we know go into a healthy society, and part of controlling what could be worst about a pandemic, from, you know, homelessness to drug abuse to, I mean, you just, the range of things that go into it. So I actually think it's a moment where that messaging, without seeming to take advantage of the issue, I mean, I see this being elevated in our public conversation. So I think it's a good opportunity if appropriately positioned, because it's a very real conversation right now.
Seyron?
Yeah, one of the things I mentioned in my in the slides was that for us here at SCG, an equitable and thriving Southern California is at the heart of our vision. And equity is something that, as many of you know, working in philanthropy, is a topic that is salient. And for our organizations in Philanthropy California, it is at the center of what we do, and what we acknowledge that this pandemic is going to have a disproportionate effect on vulnerable communities, and in particular communities of color, women, and people with disabilities. I mean, the list will go on. And so having that equity lens that we've committed ourselves to pre-pandemic, to continue using that filter as we are in this reactionary responsive mode, I think will be particularly important. And the other piece is the connection of all the relief bills happening right now are acknowledging that they're leaving certain people out of that conversation as well, and highlighting that. Just a really quick example, you know, a lot of the social safety net programs that are getting an increase, and depending on who you ask, whether or not that increase is large enough, but a lot of social safety nets are getting the increase will not be applicable to immigrant families. In a state like California is going to be really impactful, right? With the public charge, expansion of public charge rule earlier this year, there's going to be some confusion and questions of whether a mixed status immigrant family that our members care about here will be able to access these resources. And so making sure that in our roles, we're applying that lens and highlighting that for audiences will be really crucial as we connect the dots between the pandemic and with the issues that we so deeply care about.
Andy, did you want to jump in?
I did. I think we're in a situation now with this. No one knows, as I think David was saying, no one knows how long it's going to go. You know, for a moment like this, it's really about the attributes of a leader in time of crisis. And I really think that is going to be the main theme. How did this president handle it? How did, I'm going to just say Joe Biden, you know, for just brevity right now, you know, contrasting with Joe Biden's response a little bit further down the line. I think it's very much going to be about how well was it done, how sympathetic, how effective, efficient, targeted, was a response to this. And right now, I feel like it's too unknown. Immediately, as a women's organization, someone who works with a lot of women's organizations, we all know how crucial the women's vote is. We hear that every election year, the women's vote, the women's vote. And right now, I feel like women disproportionately are probably more emotionally affected by what's going on. And I think we're going to see that in the healthcare sector. We're going to be looking at the educational world, maybe with a whole new level, a different level of respect, more gratitude perhaps among many voters for our healthcare workers, our teachers, our first responders. And I think that there might be a chance for some shifting in traditional voting patterns, just depending on how these groups are appreciated and applauded for what they're doing right now. We're very much following the women because those are our people, but we know how critical they are in the election. So I think that's both candidates for president and whoever is ultimately going to run against him. Their messaging needs to be perfect because I think they've got a great opportunity.
Thanks, Andy, and say Ron and David. And one thing that comes to mind, David, you mentioned that there's been a shift already to virtual town halls and many other things that are happening. But of course, what that raises is that we are now so reliant on access, on people having the equipment they need. And it raises, say, Ron, to your point, a real question around equity. When you go to this world where you have to rely on being able to do a Zoom meeting, who's being left out? And it tends to be communities who are traditionally left out. So one thing in some of the work that I do is thinking that this particular crisis allows a more profound light to be shed on that issue of how you get access to even, be part of our civil society, be engaged with our candidates. So just another angle on all of this. Sandra, I'm going to throw to you to see what thoughts you might have for our speakers.
There we go. I think as we look forward to the next couple of weeks and months, we're all going to be affected by profound change. Our work lives as well as our communities, and it's all going to culminate the next couple of months. And I'm wondering, I would love to hear from each of you as you look forward between now and the election. What is the one thing that you all are going to be keeping in mind or top of mind for your organization between now and the election? Who wants to go first? Say Ron. How about you?
That deep breath was to figure out an answer. So taking a step back, I think, in terms of figuring out what the next few months look like. From our perspective, philanthropy is a partner with our nonprofit communities and works with communities to do this. And so maintaining this idea that solutions should come from community, solutions should come from people with lived experience, right? To heal the system requires the people who lived in the system, I think is a phrase I heard earlier this week. I think that's going to be really important to us as we get through this and as we think about the role of civic engagement and civic institutions as we roll into the elections, is given the fact that the premise of our government is that elections are free and fair and that they're conducted. And that when we have situations where we're now postponing primaries and we may go to all mail ballots depending on the scenario, is what does that mean for our governing institutions if the primary view of authenticity and legitimacy is called into question because of the disruptions that the pandemic is causing? And so what is our role in philanthropy and as an organization that serves philanthropy to shore up the institutions, to make sure that that everyone understands that the legitimacy that our government operates on through elections is protected, is safe, and that everyone has access to that. If you're eligible to vote, that you can. I think that's something that we're going to be wrestling with and be thinking through in the next few months.
Thank you. David?
Well, I mean, you know, look, this is big. This is big. This is, you know, we can read our history about 1918, and we can read 1919, and we can read our history about 1929 and the changes that came in terms of government and our society because of gigantic economic dislocations. So it's hard to predict, but I think we're at that moment where there is, as there was then, really dangerous countervailing winds in our society. In both of those cases, there was, you know, whenever the societies are stressed, and we've seen it in the US and other places as well, even before this happened, there is, you know, there are groups to be blamed. There's the inequities that Seyron and others have mentioned that become only more exacerbated. There's risk of danger and hostility in an environment where we're as polarized as certainly any of us can imagine in, you know, since a different point in our history, really, that predates when most of us lived. So I think it's a very tricky time, but I also think, and I'm only guessing because none of us knows, that the reality of what we're going to be facing, even in red states as well as blue states that were more internationally connected and therefore sort of have had are having the impact of the virus earlier, I think is going to cause a reckoning that, first of all, there's obviously going to be real financial challenges for nonprofits as there are for our business community. But I do think it's a moment where the idea of collective good has as much of an opportunity to make a comeback as a civic ethic and as a governing principle as any time in our lifetimes where we've really seen it go the other way over many decades. So we'll see.
Here. Yeah, hear, hear. Angie, last word? Anything to add in?
David, I couldn't agree more. I think you're absolutely right. That whole notion of a collective good and the importance we attach to it is going to be much more forefront, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on. I would say for us, you know, what's top of mind is what can we do to continue our work, providing, you know, what is going on, how can we follow the news of the day, the issues of the day through this lens, and then be informed by our supporters and our members, you know, kind of the messaging, the tone that they want to hear. So to that end, we've actually just started, I'm sure many of you have kind of done the same thing or heard about it. We're now cataloging all of the positive stories, you know, those heroes of the days. We always would feature champion women, you know, women pioneers. Immediately there was a pivot. We need to look at women who are out there right now in the schools, in the emergency rooms, driving the trucks to get to the grocery stores, you know, so it was a way we had the structure there, but we're able to provide that content and that good news, but really within the lens, you know, of what we're dealing with today. So that would definitely be top of mind, you know, following.
Andy, I'm so glad you mentioned that because there are so many organizations that are really trying to capture those stories in order to be able to tell the broader story down the road and to try to capture this community good as in order to strengthen our civil society. So thank you. Thanks for that great reminder. So I think we go back to Sue or to Cindy.
You're going to go to me for just a moment. So I have an opportunity to thank our speakers for joining us this evening. This was a great conversation, very interesting. We got a lot of ground covered in everything we talked about. I want to remind everybody that we will have another workshop in June where we're going to use the conventions, whatever they might be starting to look like, as a jumping off point for that conversation. And of course, on behalf of my colleague Sandra, we want to again thank Columbia University the Nonprofit Management Program, for giving us this wonderful opportunity to design and to host these workshops. So with that, I'm going to throw over to Cindy for a few parting words.
What an amazing evening. I want to thank everybody for this. I really, really appreciated the last comments in particular about the reckoning that we're having now. I think we can do a lot of good actually through the reckoning. These kinds of moments in civil society and in the public sphere really point out all that is needed from our particular sector and our engagement. Very few things engage entire countries and communities and even internationally as much as elections, as much as public health crises, and we play a huge, huge role in those communities and in helping influence. We're there as the support in communities, and our sector deserves to have a voice. So one major mission of this series is, of course, to actually show what it looks like on the ground. It can be very easy to talk about how to think about policy or advocacy and think about it in very highfalutin terms. But one thing I had noted over the many years that I've been dealing in this particular arena is that not that many people in the past had really been truly expert in thinking about how to move it forward in this particular sector. There is a different messaging that goes on. There's a reason that we had David Stone join us on this. And Saron and Andy have seen it up close and personal, as have both Sue and Sandra. We want to show how policy and advocacy looks on the ground, in the trenches, at different junctures in a major election cycle. We could only have imagined at the time this series, when I first was thinking about it and talking to Sue and Sandra, just how important this would become. So our mission at Columbia University is to educate, and we hope we are helping meet that by having so many wonderful and amazing and articulate experts come and help share their experiences and their expertise with our current and our future leaders in our sector. If there's ever been a time to show that no one sector gets to solve the big problems alone, it's right now. It's government, and it's the private sector, and it's our sector as well. So here for public-private partnerships and all sorts of things. And I cannot thank everybody enough here. David, Andy, Saron, Sue, and Sandra, for all of your expertise. I also want to thank our nonprofit management staff, Megan, Robin, Francis, and our event staff, media, the tech teams. We look forward to seeing you in June for our next installment within this series. You can look for all of this online, follow us on social media, and your invitation will be in the email, as we say. With that, I want to thank everyone again. Please be safe. Please be healthy. We're all in this together. Good night.